In the pages of some of Marvel Comics' latest X-Men series, the publisher is set to wind down their first crossover for the landmark From the Ashes initiative known as Raid on Greymalkin. Raid on Greymalkin sees the X-Men trying to raid the former Xavier Institute, now turned into a prison to save so many of their fellow mutants. My name is Arako Braddock, and today, let's go ahead and recap some of the pivotal issues of Raid on Greymalkin as we prepare to enter the next phase of From the Ashes and the remaining X-Men comics. But before we get deeper into the video, I want to encourage you to consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button over on this video as well. Without further ado here, I want to show off some of the covers for Raid on Greymalkin, starting with the comic book that kicked off everything here with X-Men issue 8. But I want to zoom out as well and talk a little bit about Dr. Karina Ellis, as well as some of the antagonists for this brand new series. In the free Comic Book Day issue introducing Dr. Ellis, readers got an opportunity to see her remodel the Xavier Institute and catch a glimpse at some of her associates. Ellis was said to take on a 10-figure deal in the recent X-Men 35 that closed out the Krakoan era for Marvel Comics, and it looks like she's recruited a fascinating team of antagonists with individuals like Philip Scurvy, who's actually a psychic with abilities on par with Professor Xavier, or so they say, as well as Captain Ezra, who seemingly manages Dr. Ellis's field team over in the series, especially as Dr. Ellis has had so many guards featured throughout so many of these Raid on Greymalkin comic book issues. Now, fascinatingly enough, Dr. Ellis actually has an ace in the hole here, and as a result of one of the most recent Krakoa status quo changes, it looks like she's even been able to imprison Professor Xavier himself, curiously enough. The mysterious inmate X seemingly being held towards the bottom of the Greymalkin prison serves as a great way and launching point for the X-Men to try and save Professor Xavier, as well as do battle with the rest of Karina Ellis and some of her associates. Now, interestingly enough, the X-Men are actually split off into two separate teams, with Uncanny X-Men being helmed by Rogue and the Louisiana team of X-Men, also featuring a group of young mutants known as the Outliers. On the other side of the coin, we have Cyclops and his X-Men operating out of Merle, Alaska. This team is also very modern and features some really fascinating mutants like Quentin Quire and Temper over in the series too. Another really interesting launching point is the fact that there's some hidden animosity between these two group of X-Men characters, and particularly with Rogue and Cyclops themselves as a result of the Krakoa storyline. The X-Men's home and mutant paradise called Krakoa was actually burned away and was taken from them in some of the final issues of Krakoa, leading to so much tension lingering beyond some of the seams of each of these individual series. Before readers actually got to X-Men issue 8, a lot of the battle lines were already drawn here, as Cyclops and his team of X-Men recently lost the character of Beast, which is really interestingly juxtaposed with Rogue recently losing individuals like Jubilee and Calico on these two teams. So it's really interesting to see the fact that both Rogue and Cyclops are trying to spring into action to save some of their lost mutants. However, on a really fraught phone call between both Rogue and Cyclops, these two characters start to realize that their agendas begin to conflict, as Cyclops is desperately trying to stop Rogue from entering Greymalkin and doing battle to protect some of her fellow mutants. This is not what Rogue wants to hear at all, and she ends up lashing out against Cyclops and even tells him as much on the phone that she's actually going to go and save these mutants herself. Immediately, Rogue springs into action in a comic book that we see later on within the scope of the series, being the Uncanny X-Men issue 7, also serving as the second chapter of Raid on Greymalkin, and once again here teasing the fact that these two X-Men teams are going to come into battle with each other as we get deeper into this crossover. Immediately, Cyclops springs into action with individuals like Temper towards the back of the Greymalkin prison. Two of the major writers of the Raid on Greymalkin storyline, being Gail Simone and MacKay, both do an excellent job juxtaposing these two different teams, chronicling their individual missions as they gather towards the Raid on Greymalkin and both try to save these individual mutants. Watching Cyclops fight some of the trustees across the story, who are former X-characters now misguided by the character of Philip Scurvy, is really engaging, but also leads to Cyclops interacting with the character of Rogue. Rogue references the fact at the end of her cliffhanger that Cyclops is actually stepping on her toes, leading to a massive conflict between these two group of heroes. The character of Philip Scurvy actually manages to increase some of the tension between our X-Men characters as he begins to dial up the animosity in terms of the emotion for these X-Men heroes. Our X-Men characters are battling some really fierce villains with the Trustees and are even fighting Dr. Ellis's Wolfpack characters in the background too. Dr. Ellis, Captain Ezra, and Philip Scurvy really seem to get more and more trepidatious as the book goes on, as they only have a few defenses against some of our X-Men characters who are seemingly just shredding through everything they have to offer. And as a last-minute resort, Dr. Ellis forcefully beckons the character of Philip Scurvy to try and enact the White Light Protocols. The White Light Protocol introduces another hidden element of our X-Men characters that once again draws up so much animosity between Rogue and Cyclops as seen earlier in the series, as it really brings up the character of Professor Xavier. It seems that Rogue is really trying to save Professor Xavier and doesn't want to lead one of her fellow X-Men characters behind, while Cyclops in the meantime has much other intentions and is looking to really move forward in the absence of Professor Xavier and in his own wishes over for the X-Men characters. Seeing this really interesting change of emotion for our two teams of X-Men is really enthralling, especially as it pertains to so much characterization, particularly for the hero known as Cyclops. Cyclops has done a really interesting number of morally gray activities, between cheating on his wife, taking out Professor Xavier, and even really declaring his own band of X-Men in previous titles under the Brian Michael Bendis era. I really enjoy just how much characterization authors Jed MacKay and Gail Simone are reaching into with this characterization of Cyclops, and thought that it was a really interesting point of contention, not only between Rogue and Cyclops, but just for the overall stakes of the comic book series as well. In order to save some of their fellow X-Men and stop the White Light Protocol, the character of Juggernaut, who's actually on Cyclops' team of X-Men, goes behind his back and actually tries to bash down the door of Inmate X. Surprisingly enough for the rest of the X-Men characters, it seems that Professor Xavier is not the aforementioned Inmate X, as he rises up towards the cliffhanger of the previous issue of these X-Men series and actually introduces himself back into the fold. Xavier really teases the fact that he's been hidden deep underground and that Inmate X is not him but a mysterious mutant character who readers don't yet have the identity of. Getting to see Professor Xavier really shake up some of the plot details in his cameo within the second to last issue of Raid on Greymalkin was so much fun, and I'm incredibly curious to see how the Inmate X storyline is going to kick off as well for some of our X-Men characters. Moving forward here, the X-Manhunt storyline is set to debut in some of the upcoming issues of X-Men, showing Professor Xavier on the run for some of his fellow mutants later on in the comic book, as a result of some of the final issues of Krakoa in the Rise of the Powers of 10 series. I think it's going to be a lot of fun trying to watch Professor Xavier navigate just the next steps of the X-Men line with so much previous antagonism drawn out from the final elements of the Krakoa line of comic books here. So that does it over for our recap on Raid on Greymalkin. I'm incredibly impressed by just how much characterization this series has managed to sneak in towards the X-Men line. Right now, I'm just overall shocked at how much progression there's already been since the beginning of X-Men. We're only a couple months into the From the Ashes line over for the series, and it feels like we've gotten a major plot point in reveal for some of these characters. When I look out into the immediate future, I'm really interested to see some of our X-Men fight against the mysterious 3K group that was teased across some of the first issues of X-Men, especially as it's starting to lead the X-Men towards another confrontation with the villainous Cassandra Nova. Of course, we have tons of other plot threads left to go here. I'm really curious to see what Gail Simone has in store for the Outliers, and I also really appreciated the fact that the character of Ransom actually got to know Temper a little bit within the scope of the issue too. If you're looking for some big bombastic fight scenes, I feel like Raid on Greymalkin has you covered, and if you're just looking for those really interesting elements of subtlety between some of the more recent characters in the X-Men universe, I feel like this crossover has you covered in terms of that too. There's also something to be said about the dual nature of Rogue and Cyclops that's explored in so much depth across each of these comic book titles. I feel like X-Men has a much different flavor as Uncanny X-Men, especially with all of the Grant Morrison elements, with individuals like Glob and Quentin Quire featured in the main X-Men series helmed by Cyclops. I really love the fact that we get to see so many of these elements really confronted here by the more traditional lineup of Uncanny X-Men, and feel like it really progresses the overall X-Men line in a really, really interesting direction. I want to know from you. Are you a big fan of Raid on Greymalkin? Are you as impressed with some of Dr. Ellis's attempts to fight back against the X-Men? What do you think is going to be next for the Raid on Greymalkin storyline? Thank you so much for coming to check out our video recap and preview of Raid on Greymalkin, and we'll be back to see wherever the X-Men line is headed in the immediate future. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon. Bye.